What if the true horror of a ghost story isn't a scream but a secret? What if the vengeance that lingers isn't the fury of a forgotten spirit, but the calculated retribution of men long silenced by history? There is a photograph, a single unsettling image from 1852, that holds the chilling answer. It shows four men, their faces etched with a profound and terrifying purpose, standing before a whipping post on a Mississippi plantation. No names were ever recorded. No official record exists of what transpired that night, only a conspiracy of silence that has defied time. In the hidden histories that we excavate here at the Forgotten Cell, we believe that some stories are buried because they hold truths too powerful to be forgotten. If you want to join our journey into the past, where we unearth real stories and uncover hidden truths, subscribe and ring that bell to get notified of our latest investigations. The Mississippi Delta in 1852 was a land steeped in heat and suffocating quiet. The air itself seemed to hang heavy, thick with the scent of humid earth, ripe tobacco, and something else, the metallic tang of iron. Stretching to the horizon were endless fields of cotton, a white sea under the blistering sun, broken only by the skeletal, gnarled silhouettes of trees that had long since been stripped bare. This was the world of Bellevue, a plantation so isolated it seemed to exist outside of time, suspended in a silent, static reality between the dawn's first light and the crack of the whip. This suffocating stillness was the foundation of a dominion built on human suffering. Here, dozens of enslaved men and women moved with a chilling, synchronized purpose, their skin weathered by both sun and the brutal calligraphy of scars. They moved under the ever-present watchful gaze of the overseer, a man named Ellison Gray. Tall and hardened by years under the sun, his very presence cast a shadow of dread and commanded absolute silence. Gray was more than a mere taskmaster. He was a living instrument of cruelty, the embodiment of a power that knew no mercy. He carried his own whip, a heavy length of braided rawhide he'd cured himself, a weapon he called mercy. He would sneer the name in a low, mocking whisper with every brutal strike. On this plantation, Gray's word was the only law that mattered, his judgment the final verdict. The entire operation functioned with the cold, efficient precision of a noose tightening around a neck. Every lash etched not just a wound on the skin, but a scar on the soul, a brutal language of pain carved in flesh. But beneath this forced order, something else lay hidden. A silence that was not surrender, but a slow, simmering resentment. It listened in the brief stolen glances shared between workers when the overseer was distracted. It vibrated in the coded rhythms of their field songs. It coiled in the powerful grip of calloused hands that were too strong to tremble. The enslaved people of Bellevue held within them a shared, deep-seated memory and a terrible, focused rage. It was here that the paths of four men began to converge. There was Elijah, a former blacksmith from Virginia, whose wrists were thick with muscle, and whose eyes held a defiant fire that refused to bow. There was Samuel, a quiet, slender man who had the strange habit of whispering to books, the fragile pages of which he smuggled and hid beneath the floorboards of the quarters. Isaac was a fugitive, once caught after months on the run, and now marked by a permanent limp and a memory that never forgot an injustice. And finally, there was Jonah, the youngest, barely 20, whose anger burned so hot and close to the surface that it could never truly be hidden beneath a mask of submission. They never spoke of rebellion, at least not in the daylight. But in the dead of night, as the overseer's drunken footsteps faded into silence, they would linger together. They would listen. They would remember every lash, every act of humiliation, every name stolen from them. And in that shared memory, something ancient and terrible began to stir. No, it was not hope that stirred. Hope had died long ago, shackled in chains. What was rising was something far older than the nation itself, older than the sweat-soaked fields, older even than the profound dread that ruled this land. It was vengeance, and it lay hidden, patient and silent within the hearts of four men. In the sweltering days that followed, a strange and potent current began to move just beneath the surface of Bellevue Plantation. The air hummed not just with the shrill cries of cicadas, but with a shared, unspoken tension. Outwardly, nothing had changed. The cotton was still picked, the burlap sacks still filled, and the cruel hiss of Ellison Gray's whip still echoed through the midday heat. But within these four men, something invisible had taken root and begun to grow. Their meetings were not open gatherings, but fleeting. Secret moments, a brief pause at the watering trough, a faint nod exchanged across a supper table, a shared deliberate silence during nightly prayer. Words were few, for the danger of being overheard was too great. Even a wrong thought, if it could be seen, was enough to earn a man a beating. Yet they did not need words. Their shared suffering had forged a new, secret language between them. Elijah took the lead, not with loud commands, but with a quiet, unshakable resolve. He would speak in fragments, his gaze constantly darting over his shoulder. "Just one time," he whispered. "One night, and then it's done." Samuel, a thin, earnest man, clutched the tattered pages of a psaltery he kept hidden beneath his mattress, his head bowed in a solemn nod. "The book says blood cries out from the ground," he murmured. "Maybe tonight it will finally be heard." Isaac, ever silent, merely cast a long look toward the dark, inviting line of the woods, the way he once ran, the way he would not run again. It was Jonah, the youngest and most consumed by a raw, unbridled fury, who finally dared to voice what the others only thought. "We take him to the post," he said, his voice a low growl. "The very same post. And he learns." The plan was not given a name. It existed only as a shape, a detailed map in their minds. They had memorized Gray's habits, his nightly drinking, his profound arrogance, his need to boast in the solitude of his quarters. As the enslaved people settled into the nightly illusion of sleep, the four men were meticulously studying every detail. They watched the rusted locks on the stable house. They timed the guards' patrols, thin and lazy on moonless nights. They mapped every shadow and every single creaking floorboard. Each of them had been marked by the brutal tree that had served as Gray's whipping post. Elijah's back bore a painful roadmap of scars from a single stolen winter's nap. Samuel had once screamed until his throat was raw for simply daring to rest for a moment. Isaac was nearly crippled from a beating that had lasted longer than any human could endure. And Jonah had watched his own brother die at that very post, his flesh torn to ribbons over a stale piece of bread. What they planned was not a grand rebellion. It was not an escape. It was something smaller, darker, and more profoundly personal. It was an answer whispered through clenched teeth. Not justice, not balance, but memory made flesh and exacted with terrible purpose. The chosen night was set for after the third full moon of the harvest, a Friday when Gray's drinking would be deepest and the main house was most distracted. The forecast promised no storms, and the moon would be new, its darkness a cloak for their movements. There was only the thick, silent night and four men waiting to become shadows. As the last rays of sunlight bled from the sky and the first low thrum of the frog's nightly chorus began, the four men did not pray. Instead, they stood in the shadows, their hands calloused, their eyes wide open. For the first time in years, they allowed themselves to breathe a deep, full breath because their vengeance was no longer a silent promise. It was awake. The moment came just past midnight, when the cicada's deafening hum suddenly ceased and the frogs fell silent, as if the entire swamp were holding its breath. The overseer's cabin, a crude wooden structure illuminated by the dim, flickering light of an oil lamp, sat apart, a small fortress built on arrogance and greed. Inside, Ellison Gray was drunk and alone, as was his nightly ritual. He held a bottle of rye in one hand, his coiled whip lying across his lap like a treasured pet. Outside, the world moved with the quiet stealth of a breath held too long. Elijah went first, his body low to the ground, his bare feet making no sound on the damp earth. Isaac followed close behind, his limp and almost silent rhythm in the tall grass. Samuel and Jonah circled the cabin, approaching from opposite sides like phantoms who had rehearsed their movements in silence for a lifetime. The door opened without a creak. They had spent weeks, one drop at a time, greasing the hinges with rendered fat. Gray looked up, his eyes bleary, his mouth opening to unleash a curse. But no sound came out. Elijah struck first, the butt of a broken hoe connecting solidly with the side of Gray's head. He slumped, not unconscious but stunned. Jonah quickly wrapped the whip's leather length around Gray's throat, pulling it tight, as Samuel bound his hands with cord they had soaked in water, waiting for it to shrink and tighten. They worked in a perfect, wordless symphony. Gray struggled, of course, but his resistance was a clumsy, pathetic thrashing, fueled by alcohol and a profound disbelief that he could be touched. Isaac drove a knee into the small of his back, and the air rushed from Gray's lungs in a pained gasp that sounded almost like a whispered prayer. They dragged him, not far, but far enough. The whipping post stood just beyond the quarters, a crooked, gnarled stake stained darker than any natural wood should be. How many backs had been flayed against it? No one had dared to count, until now. They tied him there, his arms stretched out, his shirt ripped from his back, his head sagging. Just then, the moon emerged from behind a cloud, casting a pale, cold light on the scene. Jonah picked up the whip, not Gray's, but another they had made themselves. Elijah nodded once, and the first lash fell. It was not a wild, savage blow, but a slow, deliberate one. It was methodical, a rhythm built not on hatred, but on memory. It was a beat from a field song twisted into an act of vengeance. Gray screamed. Samuel closed his eyes, his head bowed. Isaac did not blink. Jonah's arm moved with a terrible and perfect control. Elijah counted under his breath, not in numbers, but in names, each man and woman who had bled where Gray now stood. There was no joy in the act, no triumphant cheer, only a slow, excruciating inversion of their reality. When they were finished, they left him breathing. Barely. Just enough for him to remember. Enough for him to speak if he dared. They melted back into the shadows, not a single word exchanged between them. The night closed in once more. The post stood silent, but vengeance had spoken. The sun rose as it always did, indifferent and golden. Dew shimmered on the cotton leaves. Birds sang their morning songs. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Gray did not appear for the morning inspection. A flurry of whispers, quiet as moths around a flame, fluttered among the enslaved. No one said a word aloud, but everyone saw the fresh blood darkening the base of the whipping post. Later that morning, 2 men from the manor house found Gray slumped against the post, barely conscious. His shirt had been fused to his back by dried blood. He could barely speak, and his whip was gone. His eyes were wide, and he mumbled about shadows, about devils, about a judgment he could not comprehend. No investigation followed. No extra guards were summoned. The plantation owners feared the truth of the story far more than the act itself. If the whisper of retribution took root among the enslaved, it could ignite everything. So they buried it, a secret pact of silence. No punishments were issued. No one was hanged. The official story was that Gray had simply fallen down drunk and injured himself. The enslaved knew better, but they followed the lie. Not out of fear, but out of preservation. A silent pact was formed, and the truth would remain unspoken, known only to those who bore its weight. The 4 men were changed forever. Jonah disappeared one night and was never seen again. Some said he ran, others that he was taken in the night by slave traders. A week later, Elijah was sold north. Samuel was reassigned to work inside the manor, a position of closer danger, but one that kept him far from the whipping post. Isaac remained in the fields, limping through the rows with eyes that never lingered too long on any other person. They never gathered again, but something lingered, a shift in their posture, a new unyielding strength in their eyes. The overseers kept their distance, the whippings lessened, and songs returned to the fields. They were not songs of celebration or joy, nor were they mournful dirges. They were slow, steady, and deliberate, songs of warning, not of hope. Gray never fully recovered. He moved slowly and spoke even less, spending his days inside the house, avoiding the other white men and the very sight of the fields. Eventually, he was sent away to recover, a broken man who never returned to Bellevue. The post remained untouched. No one approached it. Even the birds seemed to avoid its shadow. Time passed. Seasons shifted. The war would come, and with it, change. But long before the first Northern soldier set foot on Mississippi soil, something had already begun to fracture. A reckoning etched into the very wood of the post and into the land itself. Nearly 70 years later, in the spring of 1920, a young man named Robert C. Dunn arrived at Bellevue with a camera and a notebook. He was a clerk, not a historian, sent by a regional archive project to document the crumbling plantation structures. Bellevue had long since fallen into disrepair, its fields swallowed by weeds, the manor house collapsed, and the slave quarters consumed by kudzu. Dunn wandered through the ruins, recording dimensions and scribbling his observations. When he found the post, he first mistook it for a rotting tree stump. But then he noticed the grooves, deep and symmetrical, carved into its surface. Something in him stirred, and he took a photograph. In the decaying overseer's cabin, tucked behind a loose floorboard, he found something stranger still. It was a small, tattered journal with mostly blank pages, But near the center, he found a few dozen entries scrawled in a shaky hand. The ink was faded, the words rushed but legible. 4 shadows took me, it read. Don't know how. Don't know why. Heard the whip fall, but it wasn't mine. Each stroke a voice. I saw them. I saw them all. Further entries descended into incoherence, scribbles and frantic sketches of faces. The final line was repeated 3 times. The ground remembers. Dunn submitted the photograph and a transcript of the journal. They were filed, catalogued, and promptly forgotten. The journal itself was later misplaced in a reorganization in the 1980s and has not been seen since. But the photograph remains. Sepia-toned, blurred at the edges, a picture of a single, crooked wooden post standing alone in the undergrowth. Nothing marks it. No plaque, no monument, just a whisper preserved on film. Those who have seen the image often say it feels wrong. Not frightening, not sad, just profoundly unsettling. As if the thing in the frame is still watching. As if it knows a terrible truth we've all chosen to forget. Bellevue is gone now, a ghost story consumed by vines and paved over. But some say that if you drive the back roads on a moonless night and stop where the post once stood, you can still hear it. A soft, rhythmic, and deliberate sound. Like footsteps, like counting. Like a memory refusing to fade.